Hello, my amazing biologist. We are back for another biology lesson. Grab a writing utensil, your guided note packet, grab a snack, tell your friend they can join in too. If not, you're going to have to call them back because it is time for. We owe a lot to our plant friends out there. Us and all other organisms need energy to fuel all of our growth, development, and reproduction. If you remember from previous lessons, the sun is the ultimate source of energy, but we can't just go outside to grow, reproduce, and develop. Instead, the sunlight has to be converted into chemical energy that we can use. This is called photosynthesis as well. Photosynthesis is done by our plant friends that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Next time you see a plant friend, you might want to give them a thank you or a hug. It's really up to you. Our lesson today is going to cover energy in the process by which light energy is converted into chemical energy in the form of glucose or sugar. Now let's start off with energy. Energy is the ability to do work. Without the ability to obtain and use energy, life would cease to exist. And for us to gain our energy, energy is stored in bonds of chemicals that we eat. So here we have this chemical called adenosine ribose, some phosphates. In between each phosphate, there is a line or a bond. In those bonds, energy exists. So when a bond breaks, that energy is released out. Now we have two chemicals that we eat in order to get energy. We have glucose, which is sugar, long-term storage with large amount of energy. Then we have adenosine triphosphate, which is also known as ATP. Triphosphate, meaning three phosphates, is a short-term storage and release of small amounts of energy for cells. This becomes ADP or diphosphate when a bond breaks, energy is released, and the phosphate is lost. We start off with ATP, lots of high energy storage. The bonds will break and energy is released to do work. Then, to store energy, all we have to do is add a phosphate back, and then a new bond is formed. Remember, energy exists in those bonds. So essentially, ATP, remember T for tri or three, goes in ATP, and ADP, the DP, stands for di or two phosphates. So this diagram, this is going back and forth between ATP and ADP, kind of reminds me of a rechargeable battery. So when it's fully charged, all of the bonds, which are ATP, we release our energy. It releases a bond, so it becomes like a dead battery. And then we have to recharge it by adding that phosphate back, and it goes around in a circle. When we talk about photosynthesis, we're going to talk about another energy carrier called NADPH. NADPH has this extra bond. With that extra hydrogen, remember, with more bonds, there's more energy. And when that bond breaks and the hydrogen's released out, it becomes like the dead battery. No energy, and then we can charge it back up by adding an extra hydrogen. So the same process. Now, when we talk about photosynthesis, we're going to be working through this process where we're going to be taking our previous knowledge of that the sunlight comes into a plant, water is pulled up the roots, and then it goes through a process to make food and release oxygen. We're going to actually figure out what happens with the usage of ATP and NADPH in order to make our sugars or glucose. Now we have four big questions: who, what, when, and where. Who goes through this process and what are they doing? Autotrophs, plants, and plant-like protists are the ones who go through this process. This process is converting energy from the sun into chemical energy stored in the bonds of carbohydrates, which is a sugar. You may be wondering, when does this happen, Miss Garcia? Don't worry, I got you. During the day, when the sun is out, is when this happens. We're taking the chemical energy of the sun, so of course we need the sun. Now, where is this happening? This happens in the chloroplast. The chloroplast is one of our organelles that we've spotlighted earlier on the first page of our guided note packet. So we are actually going to draw this simple version of a chloroplast in the box at the bottom of your page. What makes up this organelle is little pancakes that are green called thylakoids. These thylakoids are in stacks like pancakes. So we have stacks of pancakes or grana, which is a stack of thylakoids. The space around those thylakoids is called the stroma, and all of that is held inside a membrane to make it an organelle. Our chemical formula for what is going on is that we're taking in sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water to make glucose and oxygen. Now, when we're talking about this chemical change of energy and material, we use a chemical formula. So we have sunlight plus 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O yields or creates C6H12O6. That C6H12O6 is the chemical formula for glucose. And then 6O2 is 6 oxygen molecules. You will need to know both the words and the chemical formula, so make sure you have this written down. Have you ever wondered why plants are green? We're going to talk about that. This process, if we're going to be turning sunlight into chemical energy, we need to absorb that light somehow. Sunlight is very intense. Plants use something called a pigment, which is light absorbing molecule. The pigment that plants use is called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll takes in all the sunlight range, absorbs the red in the blue, and reflects back green. So we see the color green because that's the one piece of light in the spectrum of light that is bounced back to our eyes. Every other wavelength is absorbed. Once the sunlight is absorbed, we go through the light-dependent reactions. This happens in the thylakoids. Remember those green pancakes? Energy from the sun is captured by chlorophyll. Molecules and are converted into chemical energy, ATP and NADPH. Essentially, the sunlight is so intense that we have to quickly turn it into short-term storage so that we can store it in a long-term molecule. What goes in is water and sunlight. What comes out is ATP, NADPH, and our oxygen. Oxygen is just a byproduct. We essentially just steal the hydrogen off of water. And then that hydrogen gets attached to the NADPH and oxygen gets released back out. Plants don't need it, we need it, but plants don't. So what we're looking at here is the light-dependent reaction. We have sunlight and water coming in, we're charging up NAD plus and ADP. Once it's charged by that energy from the sun, it leaves ATP, NADPH, and oxygen is released out. That ATP and NADPH, those short-term storage molecules need to go to the Calvin cycle to create glucose. So step 2 is the Calvin cycle or light-independent reactions. This happens in the stroma in the space outside the thylakoid. The ATP and NADPH release their energy to turn 6 carbon dioxides into glucose. Glucose, if you remember, is C6H12O6. So we do need 6 carbons. So what comes in is ATP, NADPH, and carbon dioxide, or CO2. What comes out is ADP, NAD+, and glucose. So these charged molecules, ATP and NADPH, drop off their energy and go back to the light reactions to get recharged. To put it all together, it looks like what is on your screen. As you can see, light and Water, or H2O, is coming into a light-dependent reaction. Now the product of that is oxygen. The recharged up ATP and NADPH are dropping off their energy at the Calvin cycle. Going back to get recharged, that Calvin cycle stores that energy in glucose, which again is C6H12O6. Now, that is the more complex version of what we know that plants do, taking in sunlight and water to create oxygen and sugars. So we need to pause and practice just a little bit. You're going to take the word bank right here and use your notes to go back through and read over it and complete the diagram. For example, the pancakes are called thylakoids, and the process that happens in the thylakoids are light reactions. The inner membrane is what holds the chloroplast together. Now you do the rest. Great work today, ladies and gents. So now we have our notes and our practice completely filled out, and we are ready for class. Have an amazing day.